With the global economy under siege and the geopolitical order in flux, many voices are being drowned out on the world stage.
What we're going to feel.
That's especially true for Africa. It scarcely registers in news cycles in the richer parts of the world, yet over the coming years, Africa will become more important than at any other point in modern history.
The world is getting old, but Africa is young and it's getting bigger. By 2030, half of the people entering the global workforce will be from Africa. By 2075, 1 out of every 3 people on the planet will be African. This presents the world's poorest continent with a historic opportunity, but it faces an uphill battle to seize it.
The economic gap between Africa and the rest of the world is vast and shows little sign of closing. Here's a map of the world according to the size of countries' economies, measured by GDP at current prices. The top 20 or so have economies worth $1 trillion or more. But African economies make up a disproportionate share of the weakest and smallest economies. The entire GDP for Africa's 54 countries is worth significantly less than that of Germany's alone. To sum it up, despite accounting for close to 20% of the global population, Africa accounts for less than 3% of global GDP. Throughout history, Africa has been severely exploited.
For centuries, its most valuable resources, from its vast mineral wealth to its people themselves, were plundered for profit. Africans today still live with the consequences.
But can their leaders work together to make their countries collectively stronger? And what are the common challenges they must overcome to make the most of their demographic dividend? It's coming up on this episode of Business Beyond.
When we talk about Africa, we're talking about dozens of different states, complex in themselves and all of them disparate and diverse. We're talking about thousands of ethnic groups and various different economies at different stages of development. There's always a risk of cliché and generalisation, but there's also a common thread to Africa's economic story.
Africa is the world's second largest and second most populous continent. Alone, it covers around 20% of the Earth's land area. There are 54 countries in Africa, according to the UN's numbers. It's home to over 1.5 billion people and more than 3,000 languages. In terms of regions, the pan-continental body, the African Union, refers to Northern Africa, Western Africa, Central Africa, Eastern Africa and Southern Africa. We'll also sometimes refer to Sub-Saharan Africa. That's the parts of the continent that lie south of the Sahara Desert. And we'll mention the Sahel region. That's a transition zone between the Sahara and Sub-Saharan Africa. To learn more about how to consider a collective African economy without understating the continent's complexity and diversity, I spoke to my colleague, Flourish Ubanyi. She currently heads DW's West Africa Bureau and is based in Lagos, Nigeria.
Geographically, I think it's okay to refer to Africa as Africa, but then it now becomes a problem when everything is just generalized and Africa is addressed as a country, as opposed to a very huge continent with thousands of languages, people of different, even skin color, people of different ethnic groups, cultures.
But Flourish recognises a common challenge faced by African countries, and she believes that they can forge a collective African economy which would make them collectively stronger.
There's a huge gap. There's a lot that still needs to be done. But one of the ways, again, like I mentioned, that we can really, advance as a continent and take advantage of all these things is by really unifying, which is what Europe has successfully done, but Africa has struggled to do for a very, very long time.
This is most obvious in trade. Intra-African trade is very low. Various estimates say that only 13 to 16% of African countries' total trade is conducted with one another. That means between 84 and 87% of Africa's total formal trade is with other parts of the world, particularly Asia and Europe. Many economic researchers across Africa agree that the continent needs to come together. One is Enoch Randy Akins. He works with the ISS African Futures Research Platform, which carries out extensive modelling and forecasting aimed at guiding the continent towards a brighter economic future.
There is no way Africa as a continent can develop much quicker if there is not an African unity or, at worst, African integration. The African economies need to be integrated together to be able to trade more with itself, to be able to interact more with itself.
Both Enoch and Flourish gave me simple examples of the kind of internal barriers within Africa.
Enoch gives the example of being at a border crossing on his way to Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire, just across the border from his native Ghana.
I was on the Ghanaian border to Abidjan. It's just crossing a border away. And I called somebody in Ghana from Abidjan, and the call rate was more expensive than calling Australia, Sydney. How does a continent develop with this kind of barriers? So it is more easy to interact with somebody who is miles away than somebody who is just some few meters away.
If, for example, I wanted to go to Mali to do a story, I would have to go through Togo, stay there for a few hours before going to Mali. Something that should have taken me less than 5 hours, for example, could take me almost a whole day to complete that journey. Whereas if I was going from Nigeria to London, I would be there in the afternoon in a few hours.
Although African economies are disconnected from each other in terms of trade, infrastructure and regulations, there have been serious efforts to change this. And the biggest is the African Continental Free Trade Area, or AFCFTA, a free trade agreement established in 2018 which encompasses almost all the continent and which aims to remove the vast majority of tariffs on almost all goods across Africa. There are currently 54 signatories, making it the largest free trade area in the world by population and geographic size.
It's precisely the kind of trade deal which could transform African economic integration.
If you ask me in Africa in general, what is likely to increase growth quicker? The first answer I'll give you is a full implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Our modeling, for instance, shows that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement can increase GDP, by more than 10% compared to what we forecast to be the business as usual by 2043. It can reduce extreme poverty by additional 32 million people compared to what we forecast.
Emmanuel Owosu Sekera is an economist with many years' experience covering Africa. He's now the Director of Research at the African Centre for Economic Transformation. He sees the AFCFTA as a major step forward.
It's a phenomenal innovation. It covers Africa's population of 1.5 billion. With a market value of $3.4 trillion. That's the largest trade bloc in the world and the largest since the general agreements on tariffs and trade. So it's a huge market with fantastic potential for boosting intra-Africa trade, regional growth, and development. It's phase one of the AFCFTA focused on trading goods and services and dispute mechanisms, which have been done very well. They managed to eliminate tariffs on almost 90% of goods and services.
While almost all African countries have committed to joining the AFCFTA and the vast majority have ratified it, many say its implementation is hindered by poor infrastructure and countries still thinking nationally rather than continentally.
The protocols of the AFCFTA have not been adequately domesticated in their respective national development agenda. That is one area that there's a big major challenge there. The other challenge is that cross-border trade infrastructure is very poor. Road, air, sea, it said that a shipment can leave China and get to Eastern Africa much faster than from South Africa to the west of Africa.
The trade agreement was brokered by the African Union, a continental union of 55 member states, which includes the disputed territory of the Sahrawi Republic. If African economic integration is to be a success, the African Union will play a critical role.
The African Union has to be up its game. And in one of our modeling where we do Africa in the world, we have shown that a world where Africa is more integrated and Africa is more united will lead to a more prosperous world than when Africa is more divided and more fragmented along various groups.
Experts like Enoch, whose research focuses on the benefits of African economic integration, think it's clearly time the continent came together in certain areas.
Even if it is not an African unity, at least we need to have an African integration. We need to have an African currency. We have 54 countries with over 40 different currencies. So these are basic problems that you don't need the rest of the world to tell you to do. These are problems that our leaders need to sit down, especially the African Union.
At the heart of this story is demographics. Africans will matter more and more to the global economy for two big reasons. There are going to be a lot more of them, and they're going to be young.
According to detailed UN population projections, Africa is going to take up a bigger and bigger slice of the global population in the coming decades. As demographic decline takes hold in places like Europe, China, and elsewhere, Africa's population is projected to reach 3.3 billion by 2075. It means that Africa's share of the global population will go from 18.8% today to just under 1/3 in 50 years. And Africa's demographic dividend is not just about scale, it's also about youth. Median age is a useful indicator about the distribution of a population. It's the midpoint age, where there are the same number of people older than the median age as there are younger than it. And Africa's median age makes much of the world look very old in comparison. It's going to take up a bigger and bigger share of the world's youth and working age population in the years ahead. To put it in context, by 2075, the median age in Africa will still be just 30. Europe's is 43 in 2025. By 2075, Europe's median age will be 48. And in Eastern Asia, covering the likes of China, Japan and South Korea, it will be 59.
Africa's demographics clearly presented with a huge opportunity. As other parts of the world get older, they're going to have less people of working age and more people to support. Africa's going to have the opposite, but that also brings a huge challenge.
A lot of people are aware of the fact that there are just more Africans, or there will be more Africans than any other continent. But in terms of there being a future for Africans here in Africa, I would say that a lot of people doubt that. A lot of Africans really do not believe that they have a future here.
So 60% of our population is under the age of 25 years. Now that could be a very powerful force for economic growth and development, or a ticking time bomb for instability. The differentiating factor is the availability of jobs. Now we have to make sure that our economies grow in a way that creates jobs for our youth population.
The message to Africa's leaders is clear. Having more people and more young people will only power economic development if they have jobs at home to step into.
Africa's growing population is a drag on growth at the moment, because you see there are three factors of production that contribute to growth: labor, capital, and then technology. In low-income countries like most African countries, labor makes the most contribution to growth. But in the case of Africa, you will see that labor is, most of the population is uneducated, most of the population is not well trained.
Enoch Akins says that African economies need to reach a certain ratio of workers to dependents. That's people who are dependent on others for financial support. And that's necessary in order for its rising population to actually impact economic growth.
Africa can get there by 2055, where the rest of the world, China, Europe, America, were there decades ago. So you will see right there, you will see that there is a problem. This coupled with the youthful nature of the population and the lack of opportunity that is being created for them is a problem. But the flip side of it also is that 1 out of every 4 people is going to be an African. If this labor force is educated, if this labor force are trained, if this labor force, are mobilized, they can be a force for growth.
There's also the idea in some quarters that fertility rates can be too high for sustainable economic growth.
I think the easiest way to sum this up is to look at the median age of a country. And if the median age, the average age is, say, 18 in Kenya or 19 years old, well, how many 18, 19-year-olds do you know with money? No one's got cash. And if you haven't got cash to invest and to grow your economy, it's very hard to make any progress.
In his book, The Time-Travelling Economist, the author Charlie Robertson argues that a cycle of education followed by a tapering off of high fertility rates can lead to dramatically improved economic performance.
We see that split in Asia between the countries that got fertility rate down first, which were Taiwan, Hong Kong, the tigers, or the dragon economies, or as they were called in the 20th century. They've all now got a fertility rate of one kid per woman on average. And that's frightening on a 10 to 20 year horizon. And yet you've still got countries like Pakistan and Afghanistan with more than 3 or even 4 kids per woman. And they haven't escaped poverty yet. And we have that same split in Africa. But we do know which countries are going to win because we've seen this play out before. We know Morocco followed Mauritius with a 20-year lag. So Morocco now is producing, was in poverty still in the 90s, but now has a car rolling off the production line every 60 seconds. That's Morocco. Egypt's ready to go, ready to take off. I expect massive Chinese investment in Egypt. And in 5 years' time, it's going to be Kenya. By 2030, their fertility rate drops below 3. Domestic savings are going to increase. They'll be able to fund the investment to create the jobs, to power really strong growth.
Creating meaningful jobs for hundreds of millions of young Africans will require more than just strong economic growth. In many cases, it will require wholesale economic transformation.
And the reality is that when we grow, nothing changes. Poverty remains the same. Very few jobs are created. Inequality in its multidimensional flavor, whether income or gender, whatever, stays the same. Nothing changes.
The majority of African economies remain exceptionally underdeveloped by global standards. The UN has identified 44 countries globally as least developed countries, or LDCs. The vast majority, 32 of them, are in Africa, almost all in sub-Saharan Africa. What this means in practice is that a far higher percentage of people there live in poverty compared to the global average. While the percentage of people living in poverty has fallen overall since the mid-1990s, the gap between sub-Saharan Africa and the rest of the world has widened significantly.
The chances are that if you're a person living in extreme poverty, you're living in sub-Saharan Africa. That region increasingly accounts for a disproportionate share of the world's poorest people.
Clearly, there is a problem, and anybody that is interested in fighting global poverty, fighting global justice, cannot do so without addressing this huge gap, because a huge gap of inequality is a big problem for the world. And it tells you that the focus of the world should shift to Africa, because if you are not able to address this gap and this gap grows, then it leads to all the associated problems.
Many of the experts we spoke to say African countries have been too dependent on global commodity prices, as commodity exports are often their primary source of revenue. It leaves their economies immensely vulnerable.
We grow at the back of raw materials and natural resource exports, which we export without adding any value to it. The second thing is that we are price takers. So when prices do well in international commodity markets, we grow. When prices collapse, our economies contract. Now, this kind of externally driven growth does not create enough decent jobs, does not reduce poverty, has no impact on household income, it has no impact on household consumption, and therefore has absolutely no impact on improvement in living standards or human well-being.
One of the key underlying factors in most of the African countries' economy is that most of them are commodity dependent. And what does that is that anytime there is a major global shock, the economy collapses. So whether it's a global financial crisis, whether it's a commodity price fluctuation or the commodity super cycle, or whether it's COVID or whatever, you see that most African economies collapse and run to the IMF, because the economy is mostly dependent on whether gold, diamond, or cocoa or cotton or something like that. And therefore, there's no economic diversification to be able to build resilience for economic shock.
But it is important to say that many African economies are growing fast. African countries now dominate lists of the fastest growing economies in the world. Here's the fastest growing African economies in 2024, with several countries recording 6% growth rates or higher. Many other countries across Africa are forecast to record strong growth in the years ahead, with countries like Rwanda, Côte d'Ivoire, Niger, Ethiopia, Benin and Mozambique performing consistently well. But sometimes those growth rates can be deceptive.
Growth alone is not enough. Although growth is very necessary, it is not sufficient to meet our long-term sustainable development challenges. Our research shows that economies that are able to grow in a different way are able to grow in a more resilient way and more sustainable way and reduce poverty and address their long-term sustainable development challenges.
Part of the solution for African economies is to find ways of keeping the value of their extensive resources in their own countries.
Given how many of Africa's resources are needed for green sectors, adding value in the continent itself is an obvious possible source of jobs.
We need to leverage that by not exporting them in their raw state, but adding value to them. Uganda has banned the export of raw mineral resources. Botswana is cutting its own diamond. Zimbabwe is doing the same. Mali, Burkina Faso. So there's a new thinking emerging that instead of sending these out in their primary state, we need to participate up the value chain in the processing, the beneficiating, and the value addition to it. So bring the industries home, because we need the jobs for our burgeoning youth population.
That plays into a wider point about the importance of African countries diversifying their exports.
So two key areas where we need to improve is in the area of diversification of production and exports and enhancing our export competitiveness, especially non-extractive exports. Along the growth with depth dimension, these are two areas where Africa flopped miserably. And incidentally, these are the two key indicators you need to enhance economic resilience. Because as you grow from different sectors, any particular shock to a particular sector doesn't cripple the entire economy because they are other drivers of growth. Now, as you create cross-border value chains and add more, you don't stop exporting primary commodities, add value to you move up the value chain and add more value, create more jobs.
The logic of keeping the value of raw materials in Africa also applies to food security across the continent.
COVID has taught us a great lesson that we cannot keep on relying on importing food items. The continent has to be able to feed itself, and we have the potential to be able to feed ourselves. We have all the vast agricultural land, we have all the things that we need, so Africa must be able to feed itself.
A central part of the story is about investment for education, for infrastructure, for economic development, and for industrialization. But few have faith that Africa will get the investment that it needs.
For the bulk of the continent, interest rates are too high. And that precludes the investment we need to see to build the infrastructure. If we look at China, China's investment figures are about 40% of GDP. Now, if we had that in Africa, we'd be talking about $1 trillion of investment. And we're nowhere near that. We're more like $500 billion of investment, maybe 400. So I think there's a $600 billion investment gap in Africa, not 100 billion. So you've got a massive investment gap, and the cost of that investment is way too high with double-digit interest rates.
That investment gap means many of the basics which citizens and businesses in other parts of the world take for granted just aren't there in Africa, including in the more developed economies.
In terms of the basics across Africa, a lot of the things that you would consider as basic in Europe, they're actually luxury here. For example, you're looking to get a house in a place that has 24 hours electricity. That is luxury. You could pay up to 10 times the amount of rent for a place like that. You know, good road networks is lacking here. I would say that in the past few years there has been a little bit of improvement in that area, but there's still a lot to be done. A lot of our roads are very, very bad. You know, even water, having access to water, for example, in some places that is a luxury.
Access to electricity is a fundamental and very basic building block of economic growth. And sub-Saharan Africa is still severely affected by inadequate access. Although the situation has improved over the last 2 decades, close to half of all people in sub-Saharan Africa have inadequate access to electricity, far below the global average.
Another key component is governance, and many recent studies suggest that African citizens do not have much faith in either their leaders or institutions.
People are clearly not happy with their government. People are clearly not happy with their politicians and leaders, and they just they just feel that leaders are seeking an opportunity to just rob the country. So I think it's a big problem for me that more people are becoming disenchanted and disillusioned about the whole governance system in Africa. And if we are not careful, the worst part of it is that more people are becoming tolerant to military takeovers in Africa.
In the last few years, several countries in West Africa, Central Africa and the Sahel have experienced coups d'etat, a sign of serious political instability. Corruption is also a problem across the continent that sometimes feels endemic.
We see that governance is a big challenge in Africa, and until Africa is able to get its basic governance systems right and able to model a system of governance that can drive its development aspiration. For instance, if you look at Africa, corruption perception index, one thing that runs through is that there's a high correlation between the score on your corruption perception index and the level of poverty or in the country.
There's also the common complaint that Africa's leaders are far too old to serve their young population.
One other challenge is a generational gap between African leadership and the majority of Africa's population. We have a leadership that do not understand the needs of these millennials and Gen Zs. Okay, so we need to establish channels for the voices of the youth to be heard, or have some youth in leadership to make sure that we have a better understanding of how policy can be formulated to meet their needs specifically.
Problems facing a range of African economies are extremely difficult to overcome, while the challenge of developing a strong collective African economy remains great. And then there's extreme poverty, perhaps the biggest obstacle of all on the road to prosperity.
We have no choice, because if you look at the growing youth population and then the number of people in extreme poverty, if we don't do something about it or don't change our mind and attitude, it's going to be catastrophic, not only for Africa, but for the rest of the world, because when the Africans grow tired of being in Africa, they will move to the global north, and then migration becomes a big problem for the global north as well.
Yet there is a deep sense of optimism among those we spoke to, that Africa is going to get there, one way or another.
There's a bright future for the continent if the right policies can be put in place in terms of beneficiating the critical minerals we have and making sure that we don't stick to the same old formula of being primary exporters or exporters of primary mineral resources to the rest of the world. Let's add the value here. The whole world needs what we have. Let's take advantage of it. The future can be bright.
Just using this as a personal example, I studied in the US and I could have stayed back. Everybody was like, why do you want to come back? But if I had been there, I would have been like a second-class citizen forever. And basically, just even the quality of life I feel like I would have lived there would have been way less than coming back to my country and seeing what I can add and contribute to my country. So what we are seeing is a lot of returnee Africans coming back to create opportunities for people here.
And there's also the growing realization across Africa that the solutions must come from within the continent.
What does Africa need? I think it needs an extra $600 billion a year. That is never going to happen. That money is not going to come from the rest of the world. So at the end of the day, it's always going to be down to Africa's own leaders and the choices its people make. And when those leaders prioritize education, when the fertility rate then falls, they gain independence and sovereignty, economic sovereignty, and the ability to make decisions, good decisions over time that propel them to even further prosperity.
If our governments are not willing to create opportunities for this booming young population, then it's going to be a problem. It's going to be a problem. It's not going to be an advantage. But again, like there are signs and there is optimism that things are going to get better, that, you know, this growing population is going to be turned and used as an advantage, and it's not going to be a major, global crisis.
Demographic realities mean that in the coming years, the world will need a strong Africa like never before. For the billions of young Africans who will shape their countries, their continent and their planet, the stakes couldn't be higher.
That's it for this episode of Business Beyond. Let us know what you think in the comments, and do check out our other episodes. Thanks a lot for watching, and until the next time, take care.